Okay, so as we get ready to look at the book of Ecclesiastes, some of the things we need to keep in mind. It's a very difficult book to interpret. The reason being is because the way that Solomon writes, particularly like the first 3 chapters, how can this be the wisest man apart from Christ who's ever lived, and yet he writes like he's a heathen? He says that everything in life is futile, a chasing after the wind. How can you be so wise and say something so stupid? The reason is actually masterful as far as how and why Solomon does what he does in terms of the book. So let's consider for a moment the plot, the plan, and then the purpose of the book of Ecclesiastes. That will help us see the argument that Solomon is laboring in chapter 3. The book, Ecclesiastes, Koheleth, the preacher, or the assembler, Solomon wrote it in 930 BC, and it is an apologetic book by nature, meaning it is a defense. He is writing for a defense against the Christian or the biblical faith and worldview. Now, all of us have worldviews in here. You've heard me teach on this before in the past if you've been here any length of time. A worldview is a network of core beliefs that all of us have, though not everyone is as proficient as they should be in terms of explaining what a worldview is. Each of us has one. It deals with the nature of reality or metaphysics, what is real, knowledge or epistemology, the more formal term for it, in that it asks, what do we know and how can we know it? And then ethics or axiology, how should I live as a result of what I think and what I know? So these core beliefs form the basis of your worldview. For example, if I were to ask you the question, do you believe in ghosts? How you answer that question will tell me something about what you believe is real or metaphysics. It will also tell me something about your knowledge and what your knowledge is based on, which would be epistemology. So, to get at one's worldview, one needs only really to sit down and ask a few probative questions to determine what another person's worldview happens to be. Now, why mention all of that? Because Solomon, for the sake of argument, is going to write the first 3 chapters from the perspective of the unbeliever. Now, in terms of his plan, what he's doing is he's demonstrating that apart from God, all of man's endeavors, his strivings, his opportunities, his accomplishments appear to be as meaningless apart from God. So the way that he presents this argument is that he exhausts all of man's excuses for seeking and maintaining pleasure in life, and in the final analysis, he says that if this is the way that you want to live, it's empty. You ever heard someone say, oh, if I could have just a little bit more, I would be happy. Oh, if I could divorce my spouse and go marry, somebody else, I would be happy. If I could divorce my husband and go and, find that tall drink of dark water somewhere at the mall, I would be so happy. What Solomon is saying is all of these things that people wish for, desire, he did it. And in the end, it was a striving after the wind. It was futile. It was empty. And so that's how he writes in presenting his argument. He uses this argument style. Notice what the writer in Proverbs 26, 4 and 5. Do not answer the fool according to his folly, or you'll be like him yourself. Answer a fool according to his folly, or he will be wise in his own eyes. I've always wondered about what that means, because it appears to be a contradiction. Don't answer the fool according to his folly, and then answer the fool according to his folly. What does this mean? It's actually a form of argumentation called a reductio ad absurdum, which means you reduce your opponent's argument to absurdity in order to show them the foolishness of their argument. So that if we were to do that, we could actually translate Proverbs 26:4 and 5 like this. Do not answer a fool given his basic worldview about life, or you'll be foolish too. Answer a fool according to his worldview by presuming his argument only for a moment in order to show its logical conclusions, so that he will see it for what it is, foolishness. You've heard me say in the past, imagine, if you will, that there's an atheist who's standing in front of Second Baptist Church right there on the service road, jumping up and down, yelling, there's no such thing as air. There's no such thing as air. You can't see it, you can't smell it, you can't taste it, unless you live in Pasadena. There's no such thing as air. When all of a sudden another fellow walks out who's a member here at the church and says, hold on there, young fella. You're over here arguing against air, right? He said, that's exactly right. You ever seen air? No, all these other things. It's immaterial. You can't see it. Therefore, it does not exist. Therefore, air does not exist. To which the man says, well, if that's the case, then you couldn't be breathing. To which the other man says, but I am too breathing. You see, he doesn't catch the significance that he must presuppose the very thing that he argues against in order to make his argument. And by pointing that out, that's the reductio ad absurdum. In other words, you're reducing his argument to foolishness, because even the most basic Sunday school child will know that in order to say or do anything, you have to be breathing in air. And that's Solomon's argument. What he says in terms of the people who pursue this world's goods. There is no satisfaction in wisdom. There's no satisfaction in being wise. There's no satisfaction in wine or pleasure. There's no satisfaction in wealth. There's no satisfaction in sexual gratification. There's no satisfaction in worldly recognition. There's no satisfaction in worldly pleasures. There's no satisfaction in planned activities. No satisfaction in good works. All of these things, Solomon said, I tried. And in the final analysis, it was a futile work, a striving after the wind. So, what is the purpose of the book of Ecclesiastes? I'm glad you asked. Edward J. Young, not Pastor Ed Young, but there was actually a theologian by the name of Edward Young, who is a professor of Bible at Westminster Theological Seminary. In his introduction to the Old Testament said this: Ecclesiastes teaches us that life apart from God has no meaning and will only lead to despair. The only possible interpretation of the world is to regard it as a creation of God and to use and enjoy it for His glory. That's actually what Solomon concludes as well. In the very closing of the book of Ecclesiastes, this is what Solomon writes. The conclusion, when all has been heard, is this: fear God, keep His commandments, because this applies to every person, for God will bring every act to judgment, everything which is hidden, whether it is good or evil. As such, the question that I want us to consider is this: do you know what time it is? That's poor grammar, huh? That's bad English. Do you know what time it is? Do you know the time? Solomon discusses that here in the first 11 verses of Ecclesiastes chapter 3 when he talks about the components of man's time, the compensation for man's time, and the challenge in man's time. So let's consider these one by one, verses 1 through 8. What he says is this: life's events, though they appear to be random and somewhat spasmodic, are actually purposed and planned by God. Notice what he said. And for those of you who this is your first time to read this, you'll think, wait a minute, didn't they make a song about this? Yes, they did. The birds did in the 60s. It says there is an appointed time for everything, and there is a time for every event under heaven. A time to give birth and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to uproot what is planted. A time to kill and a time to heal. A time to tear down and a time to build up. A time to weep and a time to laugh. A time to mourn and a time to dance. A time to throw stones and a time to gather stones. A time to embrace and a time to shun embracing. A time to search and a time to give up as lost. A time to keep and a time to throw away. A time to tear apart and a time to sew together. A time to be silent and a time to speak. A time to love and a time to hate. A time for war and a time for peace. What Solomon is doing by this, and it's important that you know this, he's using a figure of speech called a merism. A merism. And what it means is that you take two polar extremes. And you take two polar extremes, and that is to be representative of everything in between. For example, if I were to tell you, we used to have a speaker box that belonged to the expositors class in this class, but for whatever reason, it's no longer in this room. So I want each of you to search high and low in this building until we find it. So when I use the term high and low, am I wanting you to go outside and check the sky? No. That is a figure of speech to mean I want you to search everything in between the heights and the depths of this building to find the speaker. That's a merism. And everything in Ecclesiastes chapter 3 has to deal with the facets of man's life that would include those individual events, but everything in between. Now, it's also important because in the Greek Old Testament, the Septuagint, many of you probably remember this, but there's a couple of different ways that you can translate time. One is to use the word chronos, which simply means a succession of moments, one right after another. Some of you, I notice as I look down at your wrist, are wearing something that measures that time. It is called a chronometer. It measures time, or we call it a watch. That's not what Solomon is using, or the kind of time that he's using in this pericope. What he's referring to would be the kairos, that is, the opportunity. Speaking of these events that fall within a grander purpose. Jim Winter puts it this way in his commentary on Ecclesiastes. The Hebrew in verse 1 refers to a specific moment rather than a period of time, denoting a predetermined purpose on which all things depend. Each human life has a span, and within its duration there are momentous events. Man may see them as random happenings determined by the roll of the celestial dice, but the Bible teaches that God has chosen purpose for everything. Man has mastered many things, but he has no control over time. Each moment, then, is God appointed. What he's saying is this. Life as we know it is actually a master painting being created by a master painter, that is God. If you go back and look at your life, there are times which in your life appear to be very dark. Those might be the dark spaces on God's canvas. You go back and think of other moments in your life, the happy moments. Those were things which will be bright and light. Those will be on the canvas of God's painting that he is painting throughout this time span of eternity. At some point in the future, because many of us say, well, there's some parts in this painting that are not very good. Some parts include evil. Some parts include sin. That's true. But God is using that to paint. What I'm saying is he doesn't create it, but he does use it. Why? Because God can use a crooked bat to hit a home run every single time. God does not create sin, but he has an ordained purpose for sin by which he uses to bring greater glory to himself, so that one day we will step back and look at the grand master painting that God has created and we will say, that is beautiful. It's beautiful. Because God is painting it, which includes the light, the darkness, the good, the evil, the despair, the hope, the mercy, the judgment, eternal life, and eternal death, all for which we will praise His name. And that's God's objective, to make Himself known. God makes Himself known by putting His attributes on display. 1 Kings 19, now, Lord, our God, deliver us from his hand so that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you alone are God. Joshua 4, that all the peoples of the earth may know the hand of the Lord is mighty, so that you may fear the Lord your God forever. So God is about the task of displaying his attributes and making himself known so that we, the creation, give him the praise, the honor, and the glory that is due him. Consider Jeremiah 31. No longer will they teach their neighbor, speaking of something that's future, meaning the millennial kingdom, or say to one another, know the Lord, because they will all know me. Why? Only the righteous go into the kingdom. From the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord, for I will forgive their wickedness and will remember their sins no more. And then John the Revelator in Revelation chapter 5 gives us a picture of what it will be like in heaven one day. And since we're saints, we're included in this image. John said, then I looked and I heard the voice of many angels in the circle around the throne, as well as the living creatures and the elders, and the number was 10,000 times 10,000, thousands times thousands. Now that's a biblical way to say there's a lot. More than anybody could count. Then I heard every creature in heaven, on earth, under the earth, and the sea, and all of them singing to the one seated on the throne, and to the Lamb be praise, honor, glory, and ruling power forever and ever. So 2 places here to receive power and wealth and wisdom, might and honor and glory and praise, twice mentioned. To the praise of the glory of his name. That's our objective as his creation, to praise him. So fundamentally, again, what we're talking about here is the kingdom. God's kingdom, all of these things occurring in the kingdom. All the things being made right in the kingdom. Everything in terms of God revolves around his kingdom. Understand this simply, that all of human time can be broken down according to we're going somewhere. There was the creation that God made, Genesis chapter 1 and 2. We have the fall, Genesis chapter 3. We have the promise that the seed of the woman would crush the head of the serpent, Genesis 3:15. And the rest of the outworking of human history deals with the redemption of mankind, which took place when Christ died upon a cross for the sins of those who would believe in him. And ultimately, there will be a restoration, a judgment, a destruction of sin, and peace on earth the way that God had intended, and we go into the eternal state. That's Revelation chapter 20 through 22. But that's where we're going. So what's the point of relating all of this stuff to what we see in Ecclesiastes? The point is this. Unlike Walt Disney and the Lion King, there is no circle of life. There's no circle of life. Life is linear. We have a purpose. Again, we just reviewed it. The theme of the Bible in reference to the dealing of God's kingdom with creation, fall, promise, redemption, restoration. That all works itself out in time. So all of life's events have been purposed and or determined by God. As such, all of life's events are under the control of God, under the control of God's sovereignty. Dr. Michael Eaton, in his commentary on Ecclesiastes, says the function of this section is to call us to a view of God's sovereignty, which both reassures yet sobers the reader. It reassures because of God's control, yet sobers because God's control remains a mystery. So we've considered briefly the components of man's time. Now let's look at the compensation of man's time. In other words, what does man get? Well, according to Solomon, not very much. There appears to be nothing gained. No gain in man's work. Look at what he says in verse 9. What profit is there to the worker from that in which he toils or works? Presumed answer, none. Nothing. There is no gain in man's work. There's no gain in man's wants, the desires, his aspirations. He says in verse 10, I have seen the task which God has given the sons of men with which they occupy themselves. I've seen it all, he says. And still, it's futility. It's chasing or striving after the wind. You know, Solomon was so committed to this that he conducted an experiment. Right? We know he wrote a lot of proverbs. We know that he named a lot of animals and those types of things. Wrote songs. I mean, just a brilliant, brilliant guy. So he decided he was going to conduct an experiment on how to gain pleasure or what gives man pleasure in life. So you know what he did? He got in his car. He drove down to the liquor store. He picked up 2 cheap bottles of wine, drove back to the castle, and drank half of them. Just enough to get a little bit of a buzz. He wasn't drunk, but then again, he wasn't sober completely either. This is recorded over in Ecclesiastes chapter 2. He said, I explored with my mind how to stimulate my body with wine while my mind was guiding me wisely. So he's feeling a little tipsy, but he's still got his wits about him. And how to take hold of folly. I mean, he knew if you got completely liquored up, that doesn't lead to a good thing, except hangovers, which are not good. He knew that, so he's just dealing with, just let me feel pretty good. And he said, and when I got in this state, I was determined to think about how do I get my hands wrapped around this thing called folly. Until I could see what good there is for the sons of men under heaven the few years of their lives. So then he begins. He says, I enlarge my works. I built houses for myself. I planted vineyards for myself. I made gardens and parks for myself. I planted them with all kinds of fruit trees. I made ponds of water for myself from which to irrigate a forest of growing trees. I bought male and female slaves. I had homeborn slaves. I possessed flocks and herds larger than everybody who preceded me in Jerusalem. I mean, it sounds like he's giving a testimony, does it not? He says, also, I collected for myself silver and gold and the treasure of kings and provinces. I provided for myself male and female singers and the pleasures of men, many concubines, a lot of wives. Then I became great and increased more than all who preceded me in Jerusalem. My wisdom stood by me. All that my eyes desired, I did not refuse them. I did not withhold my heart from any pleasure, for my heart was pleased because of all of my labor, and this was my reward for all my labor. Thus I considered all my activities which my hands had done, and the labor which I exerted, and behold, here's the conclusion. All was vanity, empty, and striving or chasing after the wind. Watch this. There was no profit under the sun. So if you know that person, that guy, that gal who wants to pursue all of the things in life with gusto, just take them and give them this chapter and say, here, This guy already did what you're wanting to do. Save yourself a lot of pain, a lot of money, and a lot of heartache. Just get to the end of the story and see what he says. And what he says, it's all emptiness. Why then is there a tension? Why is there a tension in man if nothing ever appears to change and if everything simply appears to be meaningless the way that Solomon said? I mean, and after all, if what he says is true, then que sera, sera, right? Just go out, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we may die. But he knows that in the heart of every person there is a tension there. Number one, what's it doing there? And number two, how did it get there? That's the challenge in man's time. Man struggles between the temporal and the eternal. Why? Because God has placed the capacity for man to think about eternal things. You know, you're a lot different from any other creation that God made. You have the capacity to think about eternal things, to think about your life in eternity. And this is one of the things that's very comforting for me just personally. When I think about eternity and how long that is, and then I think about the greatness of God, that He is inexhaustible. Do you realize we are going to go through eternity forever and ever and ever and ever and never exhaust God's knowledge, God's goodness, God's grace, or God's love? Now I say that that's different for us. Why? Because the thing that I just told you, you have the capacity to think about that. My dog, and I love my German Shepherd, he doesn't sit around in the front of the fireplace looking up at me going, I wonder what is my place in this universe and what is my meaning in life and my position. He doesn't think about those things. Only human beings who are created in the image and likeness of God have the capacity to think about those things, thus the internal struggle. That's why Blaise Pascal, the famous French mathematician, could say there is a God-shaped vacuum in the heart of every man which cannot be filled by any created thing, but only by God, the Creator, made known through Jesus Christ. That's why Solomon could say he has made everything appropriate in its time. He has also set eternity in the heart of every person. Yet so, and here's where the tension comes, that man will not find out the work which God has done from the beginning to the end. Dan Estes says, God made human beings and placed eternity within them, but humans are bound by time, but they are wired for eternity. They intuitively know that there must be meaning somewhere, and that they were made for more than just vain toil or work, that you were made more for that. The problem is that Solomon said it best, man is ignorant of God's eternal plan. Man will not find out the work which God has done from the beginning to the end. He has to live it out, has to work it through. We've seen what I'm about to show you in the past, at least most of you have. For those of that you haven't, in terms of God's eternal plan, there are some things we can know about it. We're not totally ignorant of it. First of all, it incorporates everything. It's not something that can be missed. Secondly, it's secret, meaning we can't know it in advance, except for two things. Prophecy, that is that which has been revealed to us in the Bible by the Spirit of God, and the eternal state of the saved and lost. Now, that's not saying that you know who's ultimately going to be saved and who's going to be lost. That falls again within divine prerogatives. That is not our decision to know, or not within our power to know that. Unless they profess Christ, then we can say that person's a Christian because they're professing faith and trust in Christ. But what it is saying is this: everyone is going somewhere. You know, there are no atheists at the funeral home. We don't look down at the dead guy and say, well, he got all dressed up and has no place to go. Paul says to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. If in the case of the Christian, in the case of the unbeliever, in the parable that Jesus told of the rich man and Lazarus, they are going to go to a place of torment. The rich man knew why he was in the place of torment. He knew where he was. He remembered his past life, and his only concern was for his family who were still alive. He wasn't even contesting being there. I mean, he understood the righteous judgment of God and that he deserved to be there. So we can know the eternal state of the saved and lost, meaning that they are going somewhere. Who they are, we don't know that until either they profess Christ or die in their sin, and even then we can't really know that. Also, in terms of God's eternal plan, it's exhaustive, meaning it incorporates everything that will happen, to include evil. And it is perfect, that is, the plan is perfect, though it includes imperfections, because ultimately it accomplishes God's purposes. Roy Zuck puts it this way. He said, in his sovereignty, God has planned the timing of all things. The events and activities God has under his control include positive elements such as birth and planning and healing and upbuilding, joy, and so forth. All of life is under divine appointment and timing. Solomon was not approving man's tearing down the building or the tearing down, the hating, and engaging in war. He was simply affirming that these things occur in human experience because of man's sin, and that man cannot alter what God has planned. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, why then is Solomon telling us this stuff? Answer, because everyone someday will stand before God and be judged. That's what he closes with. Verse 17 of chapter 3, he said, I said to myself, God will judge both the righteous man and the wicked man, for a time of every matter and for every deed is there. He even closes the book in Ecclesiastes chapter 12. The last two verses of the book, he talks about this future judgment. He said the conclusion when all has been heard is this: fear God and keep his commands. Why? Because this applies to every person. For reason, God will bring every act to judgment. Everything which is hidden, whether it is good or evil. So what is it then that will be judged? Again, for those of you who have been here for a while, will understand in terms of judgment, it incorporates our thoughts. We see that from 1 Corinthians 4, where Paul writes, therefore do not go on passing judgment before the time, but wait until the Lord comes, who will both bring to light the things in the darkness and disclose the motives of men's hearts. He's not simply going to judge the action. It says that Christ has the capacity, because he is God, to not only know why what you did, but why you did what you did, to disclose the motive. And then each man's praise will come from God. So the sum of your life consists of your thoughts and your words. Matthew 12, I tell you, every careless word that people speak, they will give an accounting for it in the day of judgment. For by your words you will be justified, and by your words you will be condemned. Why such a big emphasis on words? Because remember what Jesus said, out of the abundance of the heart, what the mouth speaks. The mouth reveals what's going on the inside of the heart. That's why our words are serious, and they will be judged. So you have your thoughts will be evaluated at the judgment of Christ. Your words will be evaluated at the judgment of Christ. Finally, your actions. 2 Corinthians 5. For we must all appear before the bema, or the judgment of Christ, so that each one may be recompensed. That word there in the Greek text means to be given back the payment of what is due. Your salvation is free. It's based upon faith alone in Christ alone, by grace alone. However, your judgment will be based upon your works. That goes for the Christian and the non-Christian. Revelation chapter 20, the books will be opened, and the dead will be judged what? According to the things which they had done, according to that which was written in the book, whether good or bad. So how does it all work? And this is the important stuff. Again, most of you have seen this chart. I know some of you probably this might be new. But you need to look at every day as a trial or tests of faith. God knows where you are. The problem is that we deceive ourselves. So God puts tests of faith in our life daily to let us know where we are. As a matter of fact, your life needs to be viewed as a succession of events that incorporate many, many pop quizzes with a few major exams thrown in. If you begin to interpret life on that basis, it will help you when the test of faith come, so that you will be able to, like James said, consider or reckon it as total joy when you encounter the various trials or temptations, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience, so that you may be perfect and complete. The only way to do that is to think and view life from God's perspective, so that when these trials or tests of faith come, on the inside you need to be saying, okay, Lord, I know this is a pop quiz you're giving me today, and you're wanting to know, how am I going to handle this? So if we make biblical responses to that, then what that produces is spiritual growth, maturity, and the experience of God's life. If, however, we refuse to make those biblical responses and we get angry, and anger comes as a result of blocked goals, selfish ambition, we make fleshly responses. As a result, we experience immaturity, fleshly living, and relative death, meaning separation from the fellowship of God's life. Not the relationship, but the fellowship. That's why Paul, for example, could establish the church in Corinth and write back to them 5 years later and then ask them, are you not walking as mere men? You're still in need of milk and not solid food. Why? Because you have not taken what God has given you and chose to grow up in the Christian faith. You're still acting like infants. So you need to press on, because life is serious business, and life will be evaluated. That is, our thoughts, our words, and our deeds at some point in the future, either at the rapture of the church, when we who are alive and remain are caught up together to be with the Lord, or those who died in the Lord, who come first, receive their resurrected body and go into the air, which we follow them. In either case, shortly thereafter, during that 7-year tribulational period, we will stand before the Lord in terms of the judgment, or the Bema Seat judgment. And He will look at our thoughts, our words, and our deeds. If we did what we did with the view to, or with the idea of love for God and love for neighbor, then we will be recompensed. That is, Jesus said, to give you the payment of what is due in terms of our rewards and inheritance, which will flesh itself out in the kingdom age. And those works that we do at the judgment, which were based upon selfish ambition, a lack of love for God, and a lack of love for men, will yield itself in terms of loss. That's why in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, when Paul says the sum of your life is equated to gold, silver, and precious stones, or wood, hay, and straw. And when those things are tested by the righteousness of God, the things which last, that is, the purity of those metals that are precious, only become more beautiful, because when you go through the purification process, heat is a purifier. So the hotter the flame, the more beautiful it becomes. However, the wood, hay, and straw goes up like smoke. That's why Paul will even say, you will be saved, but the smell of smoke will be on you. So don't be the guy or the gal who misses out on rewards. Instead, understand that every day that you wake up, whether it's 4 o'clock in the morning, 5 o'clock in the morning, 6 o'clock in the morning, or you're lazy and get up at 11, your life needs to be viewed, and I don't know that to be the case about you guys, right? Your life needs to be viewed as one of two baskets. In that every day, you're either putting good works in there, that is, those things which yield from a heart motivation to love and please God, go into one basket. That's what's going to be evaluated. Those things, again, evaluated at the judgment, go into the other basket. That's not going to make it into eternity. In other words, that's not going to yield for you and to you a reward, something positive, or your inheritance. Now, some of you might be saying, is heaven really like that? I mean, I thought we were after all, we were all together, kind of like hanging out on clouds, playing cards. Not cards, harps, playing cards. Of course, it would be old maid. Yeah. No. There are differing levels of rewards and inheritance. And how do I know that? Jesus said in Matthew chapter 5, there is a distinction between the greatness and those who are great in the kingdom, those who are least in the kingdom. So if there's a contrast of people, that means what? Differing levels. Even Jesus said, remember, who was the greatest man who ever lived? John the Baptist. Now, that's not me saying that. Jesus said that. Yet he said, however, the one who is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than John. So there is a distinction in how we will have the capacity to reflect the glory of God in the kingdom age. So that when we get to heaven, some people are going to shine as bright as the sun. And some people will be up there with matchsticks. The reason I tell you that is this: the choice is yours. While God gives you the time, knowing that every day you are investing in the kingdom. So invest well. And as Paul says, in terms of the Christian life, it is a race. So run the race well.